Welcome, and thanks for joining us. We're pleased to present another in our ongoing series of continuing professional education webcasts to help companies and individuals conquer challenges as they plan for what's next. Our presentation will start in a few moments. Before we begin, here are a few things to keep in mind. You can customize how you both view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can also adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons, each relating to a different aspect of our session. You can download the group attendance sheet and a PDF copy of today's slides from the slide deck and handouts widget to the right of the slide view. You can ask our presenter questions during the webcast by typing a question in the Q&A window below the slide view and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions during the presentation or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty during today's presentation, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session will offer you 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the requirements as specified by the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of the polling questions, which we'll ask throughout today's presentation. To respond to a poll, click the button next to your answer. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget to open a PDF file that you can save to your computer. Don't worry if you can't download your PDF certificate today. We'll email a copy to you in 2 weeks. If you're attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our attendance sheet to receive CPE credit. The attendance sheet is available in the slide deck and handouts widget. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. Also note that CPE credit can be awarded only to participants registered as themselves and isn't available to participants who view the on-demand version. As a reminder, the presentation you're about to see isn't legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
Good morning and welcome. Moss Adams is pleased to present today's webcast, Rethink KPIs. Which metrics should you focus on? I'm pleased to introduce today's presenters from Moss Adams, Colleen Rosilis, Director, Loren Den Herder, Managing Director, and Annie Rose Favreau, Manager. With that, I'll turn it over to Annie Rose to get us started.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction. So today we wanted to focus on a couple different key areas. And the first topic we wanted to talk about is thinking about why a smaller set of KPIs can really improve your data analytics. We know that some of you may be in the position of needing to narrow in your list of key performance indicators, or you might be in a position where you need to convince other members of your leadership team that focusing on this smaller set can be helpful. And so some of the things we want to give you today is some language to talk about that and some really good reasons for why we see value in having a smaller set of KPIs. We also want to look at some specific KPIs that we're seeing some of our clients focus on we're calling it a post-pandemic world. I don't know if we're quite there yet, but in whatever our new normal is, we want to talk about some of the KPIs that we're seeing be the most useful and most valuable to our clients. And then finally, we want to round out the day thinking about a KPI-driven budgeting process, because we know that that is one of the primary ways that we can be using these critical pieces of data to inform our day-to-day operations and budgeting. So those are just a couple of the pieces we wanted to cover today, but we're actually going to start out here with our very first polling question, just to get a sense of where everyone is at in this sort of world of KPIs.
And here's our first polling question. What is the state of your organization's KPIs? A, we have great and insightful KPIs. B, we track KPIs, but they do not provide useful insights. C, we don't track and or use KPIs to inform decisions. Great.
So we'll keep this polling question up for about 45 seconds here. We want to give folks time to fill this out. One of the reasons we wanted to ask this is because I think that we have different information will hit differently depending on where you are, whether you're in an A, B, or C category. If you are in that A category, I think a lot of today's conversation will really be around what's our next step? Where do we want to focus next in terms of making sure that our KPIs are up to date and really relevant for today's operating environment? If you're in that B column, I think this is an area where you'll be able to sort of ratchet up the usefulness of your KPIs based on what we're talking about today. And then if you're in the C group, great, fantastic, welcome. I think a lot of the information we'll cover today will be relevant to you. But I'm curious, Colleen and Loren, who are on the line with me here too, where do you see most of your clients falling along this spectrum?
So I actually see, this is Loren, we actually see a lot of ours kind of trending between that A and B. And what we find is it has a lot to do with sustainability. You know, sometimes when a KPI or set of KPIs on a dashboard are introduced, it is interesting up front, and it tends to decline over time. And that's what we like to look into, is to see, what is driving that? Is it around communication, or is it around timeliness? A lot of different factors kind of work into that. Again, sure, Colleen, you see some of the similar things.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And actually, we just had a comment put in the Q&A box that I think a lot of organizations that I work in would agree with, which was that we're in all three categories depending on what we're talking about, right? That like some of our KPIs are really relevant, some areas it feels like we don't track anything and we can't make data-driven decisions, and in some areas it feels like we're just checking the box and we're not really getting any insights out of it. And I think that that can often lead to these challenges where we've got leadership teams where we have varying levels of interest in, belief in, and reliance upon data then to make decisions. And then it's more challenging for us to all be able to be aligned and to gather information and to really go ahead and all move toward achieving our strategic goals, which is even more critical when we're moving through a crisis like we all have been operating in for the past year and a half. So Danielle, do we have our polling results to share?
Well, this is impressive. So we have the most in A, and kind of feeding off of your comment there about calling about different KPIs having different interest points. I like to think of them as a team sport, and you really have to talk about them and be really honest. If there are KPIs that aren't working so well, have that conversation and switch it up a bit. And for those that are working well, respond to them and figure out, what it is that's working well for them.
Yeah, these are actually really good results. I'm pretty impressed. All right, so let's get into some of the meat of this. We wanted to start out with talking about just really focusing on that small set of KPIs. Performance measures have been around for a really long time. I was having a little bit of nerdy fun this morning and trying to figure out when performance measurement started. I think probably performance measurement started when the first financial statement was generated, but actually GE first used the term key corporate performance measure in 1951, which I thought was a pretty interesting little factoid to take away. But, I think in higher education really and in the public sector, we really saw KPIs take hold in the late 90s and early 2000s. And that was really because we were able to be assisted by technology, our ability to quickly aggregate and report data. And today we have more data than we know what to do with, which can be just as bad as no data. So we really want to focus on those financial, operational, and outcome measures that are meaningful and help you make decisions and not really stick with data just for data's sake. So Loren, do you have some other thoughts about this question? Because I know you really run into and wade through lots and lots of data sets to get to those core KPIs.
Yeah, so we often have the conversation around keeping the K in KPIs. So if it's not key, that's where we tend to run into sustainability issues and where interest tends to taper off over time. And it's really important for us to have that conversation, with clients around, what are the few things that really drive the message. And if there are too many of them, it tends to muddle the message a bit. And so different constituencies can get kind of lost or focused on one thing, and another you don't know if we're really all focused on the same thing. And so when this really reveals itself is when you get into a crisis. Kind of on an ongoing basis, you can have these conversations, but then when you get into the crisis situation, that's where really the clarity of the message comes in and is really important. And it kind of gets us to the next slide here where, what are the lessons from the pandemic? And, maybe this could be, what are the lessons from a crisis in general? Because there tends to be some things that run in common with them. And what I find kind of, the most common is for those organizations that are on a regular basis having the conversation around their KPIs and have really focused in on the clarity of the KPIs. When it comes to a time of crisis, they're not all of a sudden changing and trying to get information. They have that and they're really executing very quickly. And so, even this time around when, back in March of 2020 and COVID was coming on really fast, and those organizations that had some clarity in the message, they were able to just execute really fast, and they really did the best. And when I say they did the best, many of them did have significant downturns in business, but their business was, and their organization was never at risk. And so they were able to act, very quickly, and for some that meant that just because they're able to act quickly and make very clear decisions to protect the mission, protect talent, et cetera, they had what it took to be safe and sustainable in the organization. Because every crisis, in my experience anyway, is not forever. It happens. If you have that, clarity in the KPIs and you understand the mission and you can act quickly, you can stay in a sustainable place. And so when we're working with KPIs, I like to put 4 different categories out there that a dashboard or KPI should really communicate. And one of them is just communicate the mission. It should reveal or just make clear what the facts are. It should set expectations and then reveal trends. And that's what really drives clarity in the message. So look at the second bullet point here, where it's talking about delivery channels. That's really about how you're connecting with your constituency. And it's a call out to say, have some kind of metric that really measures how you're connecting with your constituency, whatever that is, it's internal or external, depending on where you're at in the organization. And then with those, you're able to then work with a KPI, like a single KPI, and put several different measures around that. So just to give an example of that, the graph that's on the lower left-hand side, just for simplicity's sake, let's just call that revenue. And so it's basically one KPI, but what it's doing is you can see there's a bit of a trend in the numbers and the direction that it's going. So KPI doesn't have to be a single number. It can be a series of things that measure a single thing. But while it's revealing the facts with the tall bars, there are some trend lines that are really setting the expectation. So you can say, oh, that trend line is going up to the right, but there are 2 lines there. And this is one where you have a method of setting your expectations going forward. But remember to keep track of, where did you set your expectations 3 months ago? And is that trend different in there? So with this, one KPI is showing you here is, number 1, what's happening on a month-to-month basis. Number 2, the direction it's going. And then number 3, it's showing that there's a trend in where the expectation's going, not only just a trend in the direction of that line. So Colleen, I think you've probably run into many similar things.
Yeah, definitely. And, when I think back to last spring and summer, I think financial models in higher education were really at the top of everyone's mind. I think our college and university CFOs were just forecasting and reforecasting, 5 or 6 times a day, right? We saw public institutions having big declines in state funding, and sometimes it was a, one budget cut followed by a month later, okay, we have to ask you to take another 15%, and really finding cuts where maybe there weren't cuts that we have ever had to make before. In addition to that, we had tuition suddenly becoming a question mark, not to mention other revenue sources from, on-campus fees and things that we had always kind of taken for granted. And so those institutions that had a really good understanding of their revenue sources and where the flexibility was in both their revenues and expenditures, like you said, Loren, to be able to make those quick decisions, those were the ones that were able to pivot and become, a lot more agile all of a sudden in an industry where we have not, historically had to have been as agile and be able to respond more quickly. And then I would also say the institutions that were more successful were those that truly understood the cost to operate and maintain their facilities. They really had a leg up because there was the opportunity to say, okay, if we are closing facilities and shuttering them for a certain amount of time, how much do we end up saving in terms of operating and maintaining this building? What is the minimum cost to make sure that we're not degrading the facility over time by having it closed, and being able then to shift those costs to other things so that we can support investments in technology, so that we can support ongoing operating costs while there were up until that point, no dollars coming from the federal government to help support our budget. So I think that, there were a lot of things that we could do to pivot, but really it took that basic understanding of where was our flexibility and where we had the opportunity to make changes without having to get approval, without having to go to our board to make those changes and make those shifts in funds, or do we have to, convene sort of emergency authority and to be able to make those decisions. Annie Rose, over to you.
Yeah, well, and you've already touched on so many of the points that are on this slide here, because it really is, for our clients who were tracking too many things, essentially what happens is that you're not able to be as agile as you need to be when a crisis hits. You're spending a huge amount of time just trying to gather data and get it into the Excel spreadsheet, onto the PowerPoint, in whatever way you're trying to get it on paper so that you can communicate it out, rather than being able to really focus on the analysis side of the work, which is the most critical thing. We can have every KPI in the world, but if we can't say what is the so what behind the data, it's really meaningless. And so I think that that was another key piece of both making sure that when you have this small set, it does allow you to be more agile, to really focus on the insights. And it also gives you a sense of what data are we missing? Do we not have data around our facilities? Is that something we need to go and get? And so again, when you have that sort of really streamlined set of KPIs that you're working with, you can much more clearly see what other pieces of additional data do we need to make this decision, whatever that decision might look like. And I think this one, Loren, over to you. I think this one really speaks to sort of that focus on where do we wish our focus to be in terms of just gathering data versus providing analysis.
Yes, this is another common one we discuss a lot, and that is just looking at the time that is being spent on working with data and KPIs. And many, many times we see that just daily operations. So the current state would be daily operations of just getting the data together, getting it into a reporting format, and then finally having 20% of the time to think about it and do something with it. And it's really not till you get to that 20% that real action and decision making is taking place. And so this is where you want the systems and the infrastructure in place so a lot of that is automated and it gives you time to then talk about it. So this kind of gets back to sustainability of KPIs, which is really driven in the having the conversation. So I said earlier that KPIs are really a team sport, and what that means is really plan to have a conversation and talk about each of the KPIs and just say what is it telling us, and have a lively discussion about what is it telling us, and then what are we going to do? sometimes on a routine basis, what are we going to do is stay the course. But sometimes, no, we need to make a different decision. But having that conversation is one where you can pick up the subtle nuances as they're coming on, and it puts you in that mind frame to say, if something is coming on, you're having the conversation, and then you're well prepared to have that quick decision. And so, sometimes what we hear with KPIs and dashboards, et cetera, is they're telling us what we already know. But think of that like the speedometer. You kind of know how fast you're going, but it's good to just look down and do the check. And when there's subtle differences, then you do make small corrective actions. And it's the small corrective actions that really make a big difference. So if you make a whole series of small adjustments, it adds up to be something that is really quite a big difference. In fact, just turn around the other way, it's probably best if you see these small things coming on because you've had this time to think about it and you've had the conversations. It's best if you don't get in a situation where you have to make a giant adjustment. Now with crisis, those things do come, but if you're picking up on the trends and you're having the conversation, you're in a much better position then to go through quick decision making. So Danielle, looks like we have another polling question here.
Wonderful. Here's polling question number 2. What's the right number of KPIs? A, 10 or fewer KPIs. B, 10 to 30 KPIs. C, 30 to 50 KPIs. D, 50 plus KPIs.
So there's 2 other pieces of context as folks are taking this polling question. And I think the first one here is that when we were thinking about this, it's really in terms of KPIs that you'd want to be sharing at a leadership team level. So we're talking really top-line KPIs for the university, for the organization's operations overall. So I think that that's one thing here. But then the second thing is I don't think it's too much of a spoiler alert to say that there isn't a single right number of KPIs that we have seen. I think we've seen clients have a lot of success really along the range here. But I'm curious, Loren and Colleen, where do you see most of your clients fitting on this spectrum? Do you see most of them in that 10 to 30 KPIs? Again, when we're thinking about sort of what is presented and discussed at that top leadership level.
Yeah, what I find is, very often for clients I'm dealing with, it's really in that B category where 10 to 30. It seems like if you get north of that, then it starts to muddle the message a bit. Now, that of course is conditional, meaning really what you're looking to have is to have a dashboard with a few KPIs on it to tell the story. And that's probably the measure that we most often come back to, is not a single number, but to say, what is it saying? What is the story that's being told? And then have the conversation and just be very honest amongst your team. Is this telling the story? Is it telling the story we want to, that needs to be told for our organization? And I don't know, Colleen, if you kind of see things that are different than that.
Yeah, I think that part of setting KPIs and really wanting to use them for decision making is also understanding human nature and human attention spans, right? So nobody wants to read a 20-page report. People want a PowerPoint presentation. People want a one-pager that's in front of them. I think especially at the board level, once somebody has to turn a page, we lose a lot of attention. And I think maybe if we can just admit that, then we can try to focus on, what's really important to us and what do we actually want folks to focus on and how do we want to drive decision making. I have had clients that have had more than 1,000 KPIs. I will never forget pretty early on in my career at Moss Adams, walking into a client, and they were so proud of the system that they had that essentially collected all of the organization's operational data. And when we actually got down to, okay, so what do you do with this? They actually didn't do anything with it. They just had it, and it had a lot of graphs, and then the employees were just exhausted by it because they just spent so much time entering their activity data, and they really weren't using it to drive any decision making at all. And so it was a huge cultural shift for them, for us to work with them on a strategic plan and then really just pick out, okay, what's actually important about all of this data that you collect? And yes, you can keep collecting it, but is there any value to really collecting it? So I see that Danielle has started to share our results, and I see that overwhelmingly we've got 10 or fewer, so I like this. I like that we have people in this webinar who are really focused on, okay, we know that people don't have a huge attention span, and we really have, you know, a small number that we're going to really use to share and talk about. And so that's, you're my people, so thank you for coming. And so now let's talk about what KPIs we actually want to put into place. We wanted to cover just kind of some standards and best practices first. When we work with organizations to set KPIs, we like to strike a balance between, you know, what's relevant to your unique operating environment and then what's industry standard, and that's to enable comparison. Kind of a peek behind the consulting curtain, and this is something that we say a lot to clients, is that you can really benchmark against anything. And we can choose peers to help you tell whatever story you'd like to hear. Boards love to benchmark and hear what other folks have done. Any idea you have, they want to know what else have other folks done, right? But what we really want you to do is to, like Loren has said a couple of times, you know, we want you to identify what's your target, what's the outcome that you're trying to achieve, what's your performance over time, and we'll often collect historical data when we're thinking about putting a KPI into place and say, is this the trend line that we actually want to show? Is this telling us what we want to know, just to see if that makes sense? But we've got some example KPIs here from industry sources and some of the things that we have seen, just to spark some thoughts as well. So we're going to cover 3 areas of KPIs. The first is financial. This is really kind of the traditional source of KPIs, really easy way to start your program, and really easy way to start just thinking about how we make decisions. And we can get our data from our financial statements, our financial system, from our budgets. We can also really easily compare to peers using their budgets and their financial statements as well. And so financial KPIs can be very powerful. Operational KPIs I really like a lot because you can marry them with financial data to really get some very interesting information on the efficiency and effectiveness of your operations. So you can get information from your HRIS, from your fundraising and development and CRM systems, your student information systems and databases, facilities and fleet management systems too. Really, really powerful sources of information for operational KPIs there. And then finally, outcome-based KPIs. We don't see those as often, but we're seeing them kind of more and more established in newer strategic plans. And we really want them tied to those short and long-term goals in your strategic plans. They can be financial and operational. They can have overlap. And we like to see outcome-based KPIs really communicated frequently to your board and to your stakeholders. So when we're establishing financial KPIs, oops, sorry about that, we're thinking about, are we financially healthy? Are we where we want to be? And so the first thing that we think about when we think about financial KPIs and really the financial performance in higher education, you know, it's not profitability based. It's about our reputation as an institution. And so there are many different elements that go into that. It's not just about our revenues and expenditures like it might be in other industries. So we can ask questions about the KPIs that we use, like, are we living within our means? If we're not living within our means and we're dipping into our reserves or we're dipping into our endowment, that might not necessarily be a bad thing, but then we want to talk about why, and we want to look at the trend and say, is this something that we've been doing for a long time? Is this something that has been happening because we are in a crisis? Or do we need to actually change the direction of the ship because of the decisions that we're making? We also want to look at kind of all of our resources, look at restricted and unrestricted funds. Are we really supporting our mission and delivering that? And then thinking about, are we better off right now than we were at the beginning of the year? I think for many of us, given kind of federal funding and things that are happening, probably the answer is yes, but the answer is still a really big question mark. Loren, over to you. Do you want to talk a little bit about your experience with the mission achievement and other trends?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I just like coming back to that mission achievement piece here. And when your dashboard is telling the story, its mission is typically measuring what the outcome is. And when you're measuring that outcome, it really is a kind of a lagging indicator, if you will, to say, are all the actions that you took earlier adding up to the outcomes that you were expecting and wanting to achieve with the organization. So while it's very important to show those outcomes, it's also really important to take a look at a few key leading indicators and have metrics on those to say, if we're doing these things today, what do we expect our outcome achievement to be in the future? And then keep track of those two things so that you're seeing, on your whatever your outcome is, what were the leading things that led into that, and what can we do today around that? Also, the way you present is really important. And so, just to talk about the graphs at the bottom here, you can think about every one of those as all of them together as one KPI. And just to keep it simple here, it's let's call it revenue. And so for the one KPI of revenue, it's good to tell the whole story. So what is happening right now? When you're saying what's happening right now, always set the expectation. Where do we expect this period to end up at? Kind of the same with year to date. If you think about when you present data and present information, what are the questions that your team is going to be asking? In fact, if you're having those regular 15-minute conversations, I'm not sure if I mentioned that earlier, but we have these meetings around data and KPIs and dashboards. We recommend keeping them really short, really focused, and to the point. And you'll get, one, better attendance, and two, you really get into lively conversation very quick. And so when you're having this quick 15-minute meeting, look at the KPIs on a regular basis, regular scheduled basis, and you can tell the whole story to say what's happening right now, year to date, what is happening, and where do we expect both of those to land. And then moving to the same KPI, say it's just revenue, we can say what's happening on a month-to-month basis, because that'll reveal seasonality. It also gives you a place to set expectations. But whatever method you're using to draw the line of expectations going forward, use that same method to project back over past data. That's going to give you a fit. It's going to tell you if your model is how closely it's fitting, and it gives you confidence in the estimate going forward. Should I be really confident, or is it loosely fitting? And then again, I want to do this call out to, if whatever your expectation is today, hold on to that, because in 3 months you're going to want to show that again and see, is that expectation shifting over time? And then just going to the bottom right-hand side, it's smoothing out the curve there. So it's also really important when you're showing something on a month-to-month basis, also do the rolling 12 months so that you're seeing, is there an overall trend that's happening? So what the one on the right is showing is that it was fairly flat going in. There's this period of growth. It looks like it's tending to flatten out a little bit now. And that just kind of, you can see it at a glance. It's happening over on the left-hand side. It's just not so obvious there. So I would just make this call out here. This rolling 12-month is really insightful and really helpful. Again, I do want to say, for every dashboard you're making, you're wanting to tell the story, just make sure that it's communicating the mission, showing the facts, setting expectations, and revealing trends. So Colleen, I think you have some example KPIs here that are really important, and good to pay attention to these.
All right. So we wanted to present you with a couple of slides of performance measures from NACUBO, and we've had actually a couple of questions in the Q&A about some resources for KPIs. NACUBO is a really good resource, especially for financial KPIs, and they're doing some good work in terms of developing some standards for for operational KPIs as well. All of the KPIs on this slide, you'll notice, have a target that has been established by NACUBO. So what's really great about these KPIs is that you can both go out to peers and take a look at how are other institutions performing, but then you can also see what's the target range that NACUBO has established. And you'll notice that they have established not just, here's the amount that you want, but really here's a range. And so I think it's really useful to pick a couple of these financial KPIs and just see how are we performing accordingly. Coming out of the last recession, and I think coming out of the past year, as we've had to dip into reserves, as we've had to dip into endowments, really thinking about the primary reserve ratio. And then on the next slide, we've got a secondary reserve ratio. That's a really good one to take a look at. I also think the viability ratio is something that quite a few institutions have been looking at, and members of, stakeholder groups have definitely been looking at it at institutions as they have been looking at kind of comparing viability across the board and kind of across the industry. This next slide, you'll notice that NACUBO doesn't want to establish targets for. This is where you want to establish your own target. You want to really dig in and figure out, where do we want to be? I wanted to point out the secondary reserve ratio, which is where we look at our permanently restricted assets. So when we think about our endowment and what we can and cannot spend. Many of the funds that come in higher education have restrictions associated with them because that's kind of how people like to give to higher education. We don't like to just go ahead and give to the general fund and let us make decisions on our own. And so being able to have a real understanding of which of our funds can we spend, which of our funds do we have flexibility, and which of our funds do we actually have to hold in reserve and we can't spend, that helps us to really have an understanding of where we can be agile when we make decisions. I think also as folks have taken on additional lines of credit, issued bonds, and additional debt, many institutions prior to the pandemic were undertaking large capital campaigns and really thinking about what debt service looks like. So the debt coverage ratio is something that we have definitely been looking at in recent years. And so when we're thinking about kind of the new normal, I read an article last summer, and it called the university CFO the financial first responder. And I'm sure many of you feel like you were performing CPR all day and night or putting out fires all day and night. And so thinking about, what do we want to focus on in this kind of short term as we're still living in a COVID world. And so one of the things that we really recommend is thinking about our long-term financial sustainability and how we can communicate that, given that what happened in 2020 and then what has happened with CARES and ARPA funding has totally skewed what our actual revenue and expenditure trends have looked like. And that we have been doing spending from endowments, our reserve levels have changed, our liquidity looks really different. And so how do we show what our long-term sustainability looks like and how can our financial models and our KPIs really reflect that? We also would really recommend digging into student financial aid and student financial need because of the impact of the pandemic on our communities and the economic impact on our students and their families and their ability to pay tuition, and whether we are able to step up as an institution to be able to keep enrollment. And with enrollment decreasing, students deferring in the past couple of years or changing their priorities, how we look at enrollment targets, how we look at how we're achieving student enrollment and student engagement goals, those things are increasingly important as well. Loren, did you have any other thoughts on financial KPIs as we continue to operate in this COVID world?
Yeah, you've gone through a really great list. One thing we always, in time of crisis, what we always call out is, in a word, cash. It's if you are on a regular basis having a dashboard and some KPI just around, the sources and uses and how they relate to the priorities of the mission. Because when it comes time of crisis and you're dealing with, prioritizing cash, it's good to have already pre-thought about what areas are really tied the closest to the mission and closest to just keeping the organization safe. And so, having that, the KPIs on an ongoing basis and having that conversation on an ongoing basis, it just alerts you to emerging trends and then allows you to then get in that crisis mode to be able to look at, okay, here's what we're going to do with, cash or resources, whatever the key thing is for you. Yeah.
Great.
So,
well,
yeah.
I'll take it from here. Thank you for that. So on the financial side, that's obviously sort of a primary lens that we see for a lot of KPIs here. And so when we're shifting over to thinking about operational KPIs, this is one area apart from the financial lens where we're asking this question around how are we operating effectively? Are we operating efficiently? Are we actually providing the type of experience that we wish to be providing primarily to our students, but also to our employees? And then this is also an area where you're going to see a lot, I would say, more tailoring to the specific type of institution that you are. So if you're a major research institution, there's obviously going to be goals here around research. If you're a small community college, that's going to look different. But we wanted to share a few sample operating KPIs with you just to give you a sense of what we're speaking about here. So on this list, you'll see some of these measures really relate to students and student success. And so a lot of these I'm sure are very familiar with you in terms of course completion rate and student retention rate, really looking long-term at your graduation rate and your year-over-year enrollment. All of these things are really speaking to, are students engaged? Are they having success within your particular learning environment? And then we also have some sort of very traditional ones like student to faculty ratio here as well. But we also wanted to put on this list some of the ones that are really related to the employee experience, because I think right now, particularly in times of crisis, you need to be obviously putting students first and foremost in terms of making sure that they are having the best experience possible. But one of the primary ways you're going to do that is making sure that you're taking care of your employees and being able to see what is the employee experience, how has this past year been? And then also thinking about some of the more sort of specific operational KPIs that you might see in particular areas. So for example, if you are trying to measure the quality of your IT support, this became very, very critical in the past year as we're doing so much more online. So what are the types of information that we can be gathering around that particular service? Or we have, I think, the recruitment process on here as well, research volume. So again, you might see these broken out by particular area as well. But I would say even more so than the financial KPIs, the operational KPIs are where you really start tailoring these to your particular operating environment and what's going to be most critical to you and your school. I think in sort of the new normal world that we're seeing here, some of the trends that we're seeing both on the student success side and the employee engagement side is really wanting to make sure that when we're looking at KPIs, I think Loren mentioned this earlier, a KPI doesn't just have potentially a single data point within it, but can actually be broken out to give you the full picture. And so one of the ways that we're seeing some of our clients do this is really by thinking about the demographics. So in particular for student success, being able to think about what does student success look like for our non-traditional students, for our transfer students, for our students broken out by racial or gender demographics, to try and understand how has this past year of crisis impacted different groups differently. And obviously this will This will still be quite broad strokes, but what we're finding is that that data in particular can be extremely helpful as you're making day-to-day decisions, because you don't just want to be looking at the average in a lot of these areas, or else you're going to be missing some really critical stories that tell you, okay, maybe our transfer students, this is really an area where we're seeing quite a bit of drop-off in terms of retention. And so that, you can see how that becomes quite actionable information in a way that just having that without it having been broken out by demographics, you wouldn't be able to make some of those decisions. And I would say we're seeing that as well on the employee side of things too, a real recognition that, your adjunct professors may be having a very, very different experience than your tenured professors, which that is true in general, but I think moments of crisis can often they either completely change the situation or they exacerbate trends that were already happening. So I think really being able to break those things out has been quite critical for some of our clients in terms of the ones that we've seen use this data effectively to make decisions. And then the other one where we've seen a really big uptick is our KPIs that are related to the online learning experience. Obviously, that has looked very, very different for many institutions over the last year, and this is an area where a lot of places didn't need to be tracking data essentially in this area because it wasn't a major focus of their operations. And now that it is, we're seeing quite a growth in that area. Colleen or Loren, did you have any other thoughts on some of the trends that you're seeing related to operational KPIs?
So I am seeing just kind of two things that I wanted to highlight related to the workforce. One is really thinking about diversity and inclusion metrics that are really grounded in employee engagement. And so thinking about our workforce development, how we're actually creating an equitable and inclusive workforce and building up leadership capacity, what it looks like in terms of career paths and things like that. I think we've seen a lot of focus in trying to figure out how do we quantify that and how do we really report that out across all industries, but I think especially in higher education and the public sector where there is that reputation element. And then the other piece related to the workforce is actually related to succession planning and retirement eligibility. So something that we have started to see over the last couple of months as people are starting to get called back to work is that those people who are eligible for retirement are starting to think, well, I'd rather just not come back to the office, and so they're finally retiring. And so having an understanding of who might be eligible to retire and what your potential risk in terms of losing that institutional knowledge, your potential for having to recruit for those positions and what your workforce might look like and what the potential cost of that could be is really, really important going into this coming year when we're bringing people back to campus, we're bringing people back to the office and thinking about our workforce strategy, especially if we're thinking about key contributors that we might want to retain and really trying to do kind of focused succession strategies. Loren, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, no, what you covered there was great. What we like to talk about when we're going through those subjects is just around talent and the different perspectives around talent and making sure that there's visibility to that and your KPIs are telling that story.
Great. So the last area that we wanted to talk about today for some of our sample KPIs were outcome KPIs. So these are the ones that really speak to how are we achieving our long-term goals? Are we actually creating the impact that we want to create as an institution, as an organization, as a whole? And so a lot of times this is an area where we see the most variation in KPIs because it's all around what are your actual goals that you have articulated for your organization. And a lot of times that comes from the strategic plan, your mission, your vision, your values. What are our strategic goals? And so there was a comment earlier in the Q&A log around how do we make sure that the data that we're actually looking at is going to help us make better decisions. And oftentimes when that question comes up, it's because there hasn't been a really good conversation around what are we actually trying to achieve together? What is our goal? And if you can get really clear on that, then it becomes much easier to understand, okay, what is the data that we actually need to measure in order to accomplish that goal or to tell us we're not making the progress we need to see, and therefore we need to make a shift in our day-to-day operations. And so when we're looking at something like this, like I said, there's not really a great sample because every institution will have very specific outcome goals that you have. But as an example, if your goal is around student success and you'd have to figure out exactly how you are defining student success, some of the related KPIs that we might see in this area would be around, how well are our students actually prepared for employment and actually gaining full-time employment in the field that they're looking for at a living wage, for example. That might be one of the things you're looking at. This might be to do with licensure exams, depending on the topic area. This can also be some of that more qualitative data that you're gathering directly from students, asking them about what is their educational experience like? Well, how would they rate that, especially sort of at this moment in time? And then finally, student indebtedness is the one that's coming up quite frequently. Again, thinking, as part of holistically preparing for student success, you may be defining that in terms of the knowledge that we're giving them, how well they are prepared for employment, but also how well are they prepared financially to be successful so that their education is not something that is going to be holding them back due to debt. And so again, you can see here how this would be something where you would really want to tailor this to your particular goals, but that's just one example that we have here. Another thing to think about in terms of what we're seeing coming out of crisis mode here is that there are a lot of organizations that have set new goals within the past year, that have shifted their strategy, reworked where they're trying to place their focus. And so sometimes we see some of the data collection really lagging behind. We've set new goals, but we haven't figured out how we're actually going to measure them yet. And that often comes, when you are in crisis mode and having to move really quickly. And so the people that we're seeing have the most success here are the ones that are carving out time to really be thoughtful and say, okay, if we have this new goal, how are we going to build in KPIs that are related to that goal? And in the same breath, what are the KPIs that we can let go of that are no longer relevant because we are no longer pursuing our old goals or outcomes in that area? And then the other thing that we're seeing, I would say quite frequently, is that I think, as Colleen mentioned, trends, right now, everything's kind of upended in many, many different ways. And so sort of taking a single point in time snapshot doesn't necessarily have as much value as it might have under sort of more normal operating environment. And so making sure that the KPIs that are coming through in relation to some of these outcomes, there are things that you're going to really be able to see those trend lines over time, and recognizing that whatever we have today, let's look at it again in 3 months, because the world that we're living in is shifting fairly continually. And so again, just having that focus on making sure that those outcome KPIs can demonstrate trends over time. Colleen, did you have any other thoughts on this one before we move through to our next polling question?
Yeah, I had a couple of examples. I think number one example is technology. So we've all made a tremendous shift in investment in technology. So maybe identifying an outcome KPI about, is our technology working? What are our cost trends in technology? Is it efficient? That can be really helpful for you as you continue to respond. And we have been making some really, kind of quick gut decisions on investments in technology. Are we able to take a step back and say, what have our decisions, what has been the outcome of our decisions, and then how do we plan to move forward, and can we move forward in a more coordinated and consistent fashion? Also, really consider, if we've established these new strategies, how are we funding them? So go back to the financial and budgeting aspect of this and actually marry what the cost is of these strategies. I can't tell you the number of clients that we've had over the past year who've established a really ambitious goal related to inclusion and diversity, and then have realized, oh, we haven't really aligned funding, or we don't actually even really understand what our funding is related to all of these initiatives, because it's dispersed among all of our different departments and programs. And so understanding what our costs are, and really understanding if we're going to make a push toward a new goal or strategy because of the pandemic? Do we have funding aligned to that way, or is it just a goal in name only? And then facility use. So, facility use has changed tremendously. Many institutions really just focused on lab and studio space in the last year. We retrofitted buildings. We focused on airflow and social distancing. And then as we return to campus, even just simply thinking about what's our facility use per square foot right now? What's our fleet utilization right now as we bring staff, as we bring students and other people to really think about, are we using our facilities as efficiently and effectively as we could be, and do we need to transition any of our decision making as we move forward, as opposed to just kind of going back up to 100% and what the cost might be, what the impact might be on our campus going forward. Danielle, I think we are going into a poll now.
Yes, here's our third polling question. How does your organization line up? A, we are tracking most, many of the KPIs discussed here. B, we are tracking some of the KPIs discussed here. C, we are tracking only a few of the KPIs discussed here.
Yeah, this is an interesting question. When we are working with organizations and their KPIs, and initially there's a lot of focus on kind of efficiency type KPIs. But we always like to come back and say, when you're talking about your constituents, it's really important that you're also tracking experience KPIs. Now, sometimes those are kind of survey-based, but just knowing that the experience that your constituents are experiencing and what you would expect that to be and how you're measuring that will help drive a lot of your communication as well around your decision making. Very interesting. So it looks like we're kind of middle of the road here, where some are it sounds like we have a really active audience here that's working with KPIs and trying to track them in going forward. And so this will help a lot in your budgeting process as well. So using your KPIs to drive your budgeting process is one where it's about keeping the conversation alive. So there's, traditional ways of thinking about your budgeting process where you're, tracking last year's spending, looking at it from a department standpoint, things to cut. But if you use it from a KPIs perspective and you're looking at the outcomes and you're looking at the experience, this is one where, you'll ask different questions and it'll be driven by a different set of questions. And so when we get back to, these four things that I'd mentioned about, the mission, the expectations, the facts, and the trends, you can kind of put all of this now in your decision-making process into two buckets. Which ones are you planning by, and which ones are you really responding to? So you're really planning by the mission. You're planning by where you're setting the expectations, and all of that is in response to, what are the facts and what are the trends that you're seeing, and that'll really help drive a different set of questions like you're seeing on the right-hand side. And while you're doing that, it is about this communication and fluidity, where while you're having the conversation around what the metric means, so for example, the orange line here would be the metric, but many, many times those metrics are driven by other things. So there's the green lollipop and the purple, and so you can have a conversation about it to say, what is the drivers that are behind this, and that adds to a really nice conversation about what the actual metric is being driven by. And then, finally here is when you're working with KPIs, there are these 5 different things that is kind of this virtuous cycle. And if you're having the active conversation, it's about being responsive to what is there. Have the KPIs that'll tell the story, be responsive. When you're responsive, you can be adaptable to the situation at hand. And when you're being adaptable, you'll find that really leads to a lot of collaboration. So it draws the team together, you're having those conversations. When you're having those conversations, you will then feel empowered. And then with that empowerment, you can make the decisions, keep the organization safe, move into optimizing, improving the experience that lines up with your mission, and then you will be in control. So I think with that, Danielle, we have our final polling question here.
Thank you, Loren. What topic would be most interesting to you for future workshops? A, insightful data dashboard, data benchmark tools that can help your team track and present data. B, discussing best practices with peer universities and colleges.
Yeah, so this is kind of a call out as well to where are you driving the conversation from, and you can reach outside of the organization in some cases and find really interesting things to focus on and ways to adjust the experience, if you will. Colleen and Annie Rose, you probably have similar thoughts on that.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see just even in the Q&A log from this conversation. Thank you to everyone who's put in comments and questions. I know we won't be able to get to all of those, but I know that data benchmarking has come up in the comments several times. And I think that that's one that we see pretty commonly, is really understanding where are the areas where we can compare ourselves to others and where are the areas where we're really going to set our own path and track what's most important to us in our particular situation as well.
Yeah, so building insightful dashboards, really it's a great focus area here. We do see a lot of attention, a lot of interest in that area kind of very broadly.
Mm.
Yeah, so I think we have run out of time here for the Q&A, but we will certainly respond back to that in an email.
Well, thank you, Colleen, Loren, and Annie Rose for a great presentation today. Unfortunately, we are out of time. If you submitted a question that we did not get to, we'll do our best to follow up with you after the webcast, or you may reach out to the presenters directly. As a reminder, if you attended today's presentation in a group and would like to receive CPE credit, you must complete the group attendance sheet found in the slide deck and handouts window to the right of the slide view. If you participated as an individual and met all certification requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE progress window to the right of the slide view. I'll keep the webcast console open for a few minutes to give you time to download your CPE certificate. A copy of your CPE certificate will be emailed within 3 weeks should you have any difficulty downloading it now. Finally, here is a link to the online survey where you can provide feedback for today's presentation. Please take a moment to complete this survey, as your feedback is very important to us. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you'll join us again next time.